Chapter 316. The Enslaved Bride, Part 13. When the three witnesses had confirmed the marriage contract, the northern lawyer, as he promised, sat down and shut his mouth. The judge then called upon the southern lawyer, and asked him to present his objections, if he had any. When the southern lawyer stood, the audience was fascinated by his appearance. He was 7 feet tall, but must have weighed less than 100 pounds. He looked like a walking skeleton, dressed up in a black suit, a thin white tie hung around his neck like a noose. He had no stomach or backside, carrying most of his weight in his long legs. 85% of his height is on his long feet. He appeared to the audience as a stilt walker in a parade. In 2 strides he reached the judge's table. 1 more step would have placed him behind the jury. He turned around and faced the audience, standing empty-handed before the court. He must have spent most of his life in books, for his eyes were covered with heavy glasses. Instead of speaking, he smiled. The unexpectedness of his grin made the audience laugh. Then, he stretched out his long arms, brought his hands together, and began to clap. The audience was confused, and some of them clapped with him. Like a train starting its movement slowly and steadily increasing speed, the clapping grew in volume, until it nearly deafened the ears of the judge. Hence, the magistrate struck his table with the gavel several times to restore order. Once silence ensued, the judge addressed the lawyer, "Would you please explain the reason for your happiness?" "Because, Your Honor, I also have nothing to say, having heard the new development in the case," said the southern lawyer, smiling. "Thus, I have decided to shut my mouth and keep my bottom stuck to my chair." The audience laughed for no reason, except for his obvious absence of a bottom. "But," he said, then stopped and pointed to his ear with 1 finger, indicating that his audience needed to listen carefully to what he was about to say. "But," repeated the lawyer again, "when the beautiful girl sitting over there," he pointed the same finger at Olivia, who felt the gaze of every pair of eyes turned towards her. When he whispered a secret in this ear, he inserted his finger in his left ear again to show the gate through which the secret passed from Olivia's beautiful lips to his small ear. Some certain African tribes in Sudan have serious problem when they speak in Arabic. They always refer to the girl as he and the boy as she. The Dinka lawyer was one of them. Although he was talking about Olivia, he referred to her as a male or he. "He also handed me this cassette and this piece of paper." As if by magic, a cassette and a piece of paper appeared in his empty hand. The audience gasped. I began to shake in my chair like this. The audience burst into roaring laughter when he bent his back and began to shake his flat bottom. The judge and his jury were in a better position to see the shaking. They were forced to laugh against their better judgment. When he realized that his shaking amused the audience, the lawyer shook more, chuckling himself. In the middle of the fun-making, the judge hit his gavel on the table again to drive away the laughter from the court. The audience stopped laughing out loud but continued to shake with silent mirth. The lawyer smiled broadly and said, "Today, in the same way, I am going to shake Mualana and his lawyer like this." Once again, he bent his back and began to jerk his waist in a break dance. This time he stretched out his fists and shook his hands as well. Some spectators screamed in laughter until their eyes filled with tears. Others fell off their seats and held their stomachs. It was most amusing to watch him dancing in the court, all the while looking straight at Mualana. "Mr. Akal, will you please get to the point?" shouted the judge, himself still laughing. The judge had to shout his request several times before Mr. Akal stopped his dance. The animated southern lawyer suddenly became very serious. His face hardened with anger and determination. If this girl has a father by the name of Mr. Abdullah Deng, he would not have written this message to Mr. Malwal and her wife Olivia and recorded the same message on this cassette, said Mr. Akal, holding up the 2 objects like flags. The audience and the court were not confused by his exchanging of she to he, and her to his, because most of the African tribes in Sudan spoke Arabic that way. For the remainder of the trial, these will be translated to avoid confusion. Mr. Akal waited until he was certain everyone had seen the cassette and the paper. Then, he moved forward to stand near Ikhlas and Mualana before continuing to speak. I am quoting what she wrote in her letter and said in her cassette to Malwal and Olivia. I am an orphan girl. The Arab Janjaweed killed my parents in front of my eyes in the south, and brought me forcibly to this region. I have no home, family, relatives, or anyone else in Sudan to look after me. Now, continued Mr. Akal loudly and angrily, if a girl had a father, she would not have called herself an orphan. She would not have said the Arab Janjaweed slaughtered her parents in front of her eyes. Moreover, this message revealed that she was stolen from the south and brought to this city by force. In other words, she was kidnapped, raped, beaten, sold, and abused by the Janjaweed, and now by this Mualana, who claims to be a follower of Allah. Mr. Akal fixed his gaze on Mualana for his final comments. He is a man of the devil and he will spend his eternity in hell if the court may excuse my strong words. Objection, Your Honor, shouted Mualana's lawyer. What is your objection? Responded the judge. His face was tight and red. Mualana's lawyer held up a restraining hand. Before Mr. Akal makes any assumptions, the court must verify the message and the recorded cassette with Ikhlas. More seriously, Mr. Akal should mind his words about my client in the future. Whether Ikhlas admits, or denies that these items are hers will not change the existence of sound evidence. I know she is under life threat. I can see the fear written all over her face. The court has to find an expert to verify her handwriting and voice message if she refuses to admit to the fact, said Mr. Akal. The court will grant full protection to Ikhlas, if it is true that she is under life threat, said the judge loudly. When he heard the judge's promise, Mr. Akal made quick strides towards Ikhlas and placed the paper in her hand. Ikhlas, will you please read this paper and tell the court whether you wrote it or not? Asked Mr. Akal, his face solemn. Ikhlas held the paper with shaking hands and took a quick glance at it. Did you, or did you not write this message? Asked the judge, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. Yes, I wrote it, sir, replied Ikhlas in stammering words. Do you admit to the court that what you wrote on the paper is the truth? Continued the judge. Yes, sir, said Ikhlas. Suddenly the room buzzed with excited voices. Who would have thought all of this? Court is suspended until next hearing, shouted the judge. Wait a minute, shouted Mualana's defense lawyer, and before the judge had given him permission, he said, Can Ikhlas tell the court why she lied in her first testimony? Everyone looked at Ikhlas, to hear her explanation. She burst into tears, her hand clutched over her mouth, and shook her head. The judge took his gavel, looked for a moment as though he might throw it at the defense lawyer, hit the table hard instead and shouted, I said, court is suspended. No more question or objections may be voiced until the next hearing. Mr. Akal agreed to keep Ikhlas and her daughter Sakina in his house, as long as the court would provide full protection to both of them, and his family. The court authorities accepted his suggestion, and promised to provide high-level security to Ikhlas and Mr. Akal. Immediately after the first hearing, Mr. Akal's house became guarded by more policemen and dogs than Mualana's residence. Until now, Malwal had not discovered Ikhlas' true identity. When he had last seen her, she was a very small girl, and when he proposed to her, she was 12. At that time, when his parents sent her photo to him, she was fat and not very tall, as now. While Malwal had been working hard in the States and saving the money to pay for the 100 cows and other expenses, Ayan had grown into a young woman, and had become quite tall. Anyone who remembered her from late childhood, before she reached her blossoming age, would not believe she was the same girl. Malwal imagined her as she had been when 12 years old, not thinking she could have changed that much. At the age of 16, Ayan lost half of her weight due to a typhus outbreak. Her parents thought that Malwal might change his mind if he saw her that small. They knew an African boy would love a girl who had generous proportions, large and big buttocks, and spear-like breasts. Since the typhus had reduced some of those appealing qualities in their grown-up daughter, the parents had given Malwal's parents her photo as a 12-year-old. Blissfully unaware of whom they had rescued, Malwal and Olivia walked out of the courtroom that day, like a hero and a heroine from the movies who defeat the villain and release the captive girl from him. They concluded that their duty in El Fasher had come to an end. They thought that Mu'alana would be convicted for his crime and Ikhlas would be released forever. Mr. Akal advised Malwal and Olivia to leave El Fasher as soon as possible. He anticipated that the son-in-law of Mu'alana might try to take revenge on them, for exposing the hidden crimes of his spiritual and influential father-in-law. Mr. Akal also promised Malwal and Olivia that he would finish the trial successfully and try to find some human rights organization or UN group to provide Ikhlas with refugee asylum and send her abroad. The couple accepted the advice of Mr. Akal, and planned to leave the city as soon as possible. From the court, they went directly to the railway station and booked their tickets for the next day, on the morning train leaving for Kosti city. That day the newly wedded couple decided to celebrate their victory in some special way. They wanted to toast the win with drinks and savor it with a hand-cooked meal. From the station they went to a meat store and bought fresh beef and vegetables. Then, they went to a secret liquor house and bought a bottle of a smuggled sherry. After that they returned to the hotel and began their memorable night. There was no night in which Malwal and Olivia could remember being as joyful as that night. After they had lingered over sherry and had eaten every morsel of the succulent meat, they enjoyed each other very much. It was very late in the night when the two intimate lovers fell asleep. The next morning, Malwal woke up with a headache. He tried to force his eyes open, but the severe pain prevented him at first. With much effort he tried again and managed to open them halfway. Since the day they had gotten married, he had never opened his eyes and failed to see the lovely face of his beautiful bride lying beside him, except for that morning. That morning, Malwal was somewhat surprised by her absence. Perhaps she had gone to the washroom. He listened for a while to hear her movement or singing in the neighboring room. He called her name and waited for her sweet voice to respond to his call. When there was no answer, he forced his body out of the bed and walked to the washroom. The washroom's door stood open. Malwal peeked inside. It was empty. Where was Olivia? Malwal became very worried. He hastily dressed, then ran out of his room to the hotel reception. He inquired about his wife, but the receptionist said he had not seen her. He rushed back to his room and began a frantic search for Olivia. His search extended to the entire hotel, but there was no trace of his bride. Finally, the hotel authorities called the police and reported Malwal's bride as missing. While he was waiting for the police to arrive, Malwal received a phone call from an unknown person. "If you want to see your wife alive," said the voice of a woman on the other end of the line, "then leave the city within 24 hours and travel to Khartoum. You will meet her at the Khartoum General Railway Station. If your wife and you ever return to this city, you would be buried alive in your own clothes." The speaker disconnected the line before Malwal could say a word. Before the police arrived, Malwal rushed to the Dinka lawyer's residence and informed him about the kidnap of his wife. Mr. Akal, the legal representative of Ikhlas, tried to find a link between the Olivia's kidnapping and Mu'alana's court case, but he could not. Why would Mu'alana or his brother-in-law want to get rid of Olivia and Malwal? Even without their presence, the charges of enslaving Ikhlas and impregnating her out of the marriage bond could be established against Mu'alana. The court did not need anything other than the written and recorded confession of Ikhlas. Mu'alana would at least be given 6 months' imprisonment for committing adultery. For the same offence, Mu'alana would be stoned to death if he were tried at the Sharia court. For enslaving Ikhlas, Mr. Akal did not know what the decision of the criminal court would be, because in the Sudanese law, no such offence existed. According to the written code of law, a person would be given 6 months if he called another person a slave, but there was no such thing as enslaving a person. The lawmakers believed that slavery was a thing of the past. So, it was left for the judge and his jury to decide the proper punishment for Mualana. Malwal took a different view on Olivia's kidnapping. He believed that Bit al-Zubayr had a hand in it. Nevertheless, he did not want to pass on such information to the police or Mr. Akal, for fear that the evil woman might kill Olivia, if she knew the law was after her. He was also reluctant to inform the police that his wife was responsible for killing Wad Mira and setting fire to the huts of Bit al-Zubayr, as the law would hold her responsible for murder and arson. Malwal was in a serious dilemma. He did not know whether to yield to the threat and leave the city, or to stay and try to find out where his beloved wife was hidden. 24 hours passed. The phone rang again. This second message cleared Malwal's doubt and confirmed the words of Mr. Akal. This time, the caller threatened to kill Malwal, if he attended the trial. When he informed Mr. Akal about the threat, the lawyer became even more sure that the kidnapping of Olivia was related to the trial. Mr. Akal immediately contacted the police authorities and demanded protection for Malwal. The police department sent 2 policemen to guard Malwal in his hotel. Bit al-Zubayr Basha believed that there was no crueler punishment a woman could endure than prostitution. Life had taught her that dying released the woman from the cruelty and selfishness of men, but prostitution would make her suffer mentally, socially, physically, and emotionally, and when she died, she would burn in hell fire forever. For that reason, as soon as her gang kidnapped Olivia, Bit al-Zubayr decided to turn her into a perpetual sufferer. Fearing the police's search might reach her huts, she hid Olivia in her villa until the police hunt was over. The police authorities searched every nook and cranny of the city. All of Bit al-Zubayr's huts were carefully searched. Search warrants were sent to the nearby towns and villages. Full descriptions of Olivia and her photo were advertised everywhere in the city. Until the second hearing of the trial, there was no trace of Olivia. Malwal went through the most difficult time in his life. He spent many sleepless nights and horrifying days. He had not mourned as much for his missing bride Ayan as he now did for his better half, Olivia. Once again, he held himself responsible for placing her in the path of trouble. She might have had a better life in the south if their paths had never crossed. The second hearing commenced with a brief summary of what had happened in the previous hearing. The judge asked Mr. Akal whether he would speak on behalf of Ikhlas, or if she would speak for herself. Mr. Akal said he would speak on behalf of his client. The courtroom seemed unchanged from the first hearing. It was as though everyone chose the same seat and put on the same outfit. The only obvious change was that the innocent lamb, Ayan, Ikhlas, was separated from the dangerous wolf, Mualana Abdul Razik, for whom Mr. Akal had predicted eternal damnation. This time, Ikhlas was seated between Mr. Akal and Malwal. Mualana looked like a wolf that had been caught and placed inside a cage. His long beard seemed to have shrunk out of fear and his false humility had vanished. He looked furious, and from his eyes flew sparks of revenge. For those in the audience who had previously revered and worshipped him, he turned from a god into a demon. Mr. Akal rose, stretched long legs and in 2 strides, stood before the judge. The lawyer was serious and tight-faced. He was not in a mood to joke or make others laugh. Nevertheless, the audience who admired him by now, remembered his former antics and began to laugh again. The judge hammered his table 3 times, and threatened removal from the courtroom of anyone who laughed without reason. A dead silence followed the judge's words. Mr. Akal suddenly turned to face Mualana, pointed his finger at him and shouted, "This man is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I am going to prove it in a minute." The judge did not know whether to correct Mr. Akal or kick him out of the courtroom for causing the ensuing roar of laughter. With patience, the judge waited until his gavel restored order in the court. "Please, Mr. Akal, go straight to the matter at hand and do not pass judgment on anyone," said the judge. Mr. Akal bowed his head and said, "Your Honor, I will go straight to the point of the case and tell the court what my client shared with me after the first hearing. She admitted that a southerner by the name of Mr. Abdullah Deng took her to Muallana's house and introduced her to him. Before that, Mr. Abdullah Deng approached Muallana at the mosque and embraced Islam even though he was already a Muslim man. He also made up the story of the 200,000 cows and the property he had in the south. He borrowed some money from Muallana, and kept Ikhlas with him, claiming to be her biological father. He told Muallana, 'If I do not return in 3 months, Ikhlas will be yours.' In other words, he put Ikhlas as a mana in Muallana's hands, and if he did not return in 3 months' time, Muallana would be free to do whatever he wanted with her. We know what happened after that. Muallana slept with Ikhlas and impregnated her, and when some people brought him before the Sharia court, he claimed that she was his Jariya, whereas at this court, he changed his mind and produced some fake evidence and false witnesses to prove she was his wife. Mr. Akal looked around to see if anyone objected to what he had said so far. When he became sure that everyone wanted to hear more, he continued to speak. "The court's decision on the deal between Muallana and Abdullah Deng does not matter to me. What matters to me is why all this drama. Why would someone lie to Muallana and claim to have embraced Islam, when he was already a Muslim man? Why would he claim that Ikhlas was his daughter, when she wasn't? I believe even Ikhlas herself did not know the real motive behind that drama. She was forced to act in a play without fully understanding it. Until this moment Ikhlas has believed that Muallana was tricked by Abdullah Deng and someone else, and therefore took Ikhlas into his house without knowing the trap that had been set for him." Mr. Akal paused and walked towards the judge, took his cup of water and drank it fully. Once again, the judge did not show any sign of protest. Mr. Akal thanked the judge and continued his defense. Before she moved into Muallana's house, Ikhlas was held as a captive in the house of a woman who forced her into prostitution against her wish. In less than a month, Ikhlas was beaten, chained, and raped by more than 50 men. She did not receive a single pound for what had been done to her body. According to Ikhlas, that same evil woman later took pity on her, and made her choose between the house of vice and the house of virtue. Of course, any girl in Ikhlas' place would have chosen Muallana's house. Before the woman sent Ikhlas to Muallana's house, she rehearsed with Ikhlas how to act out the drama of Mr. Abdullah Deng and his daughter. This Mr. Deng was one of the woman's gangsters. In that way, the woman led Ikhlas to believe that she could enter Muallana's house without suspicion. The woman told Ikhlas that Muallana's wife would treat her as a maidservant, but without payment. Once again I will remind you of what happened to Ikhlas in Muallana's house. She was turned into a slave by Muallana's wife and later on became a Jariya to Muallana himself, bearing his child. This is the story as Ikhlas narrated it to me. Why this whole drama had been created, she did not know. Mr. Akal paused and looked around for a clever individual to solve the riddle of the drama he had just shared. Even the judge seemed to be confused and did not know what to say, so he looked at Mr. Akal, hoping he would reveal the answer to the riddle. Mr. Akal spoke to the court again. "I personally believe that Muallana had a hand in this dirty game. He had a connection with the underground world. Everyone in this court knows the identity of the evil woman who forced Ikhlas into prostitution and sold her as a slave to Muallana. That woman we all know as Bint al-Zubair Basha." "Objection, Your Honor," shouted Muallana himself. "What is your objection?" inquired the judge. Muallana was furious. "I have no connection with any bad woman or bad people. I was born and raised in a good Islamic home. I have been reared from my childhood in the Sunnah of the Prophet. I have..." "Stop, please," said the judge, interrupting Muallana's bragging about his upbringing. Whatever has been said about you by the defense lawyer will not be held against you unless it is verified and proven to be true. For the time being, the court issues an arrest warrant against Bint al-Zubayr Basha. Until then, the court is adjourned.